Good afternoon. You're all very welcome to this CEPS-EconPol lunch debate. We have a couple of great speakers for you today. We're going to be discussing tax incentives for research and development and asking, is there an optimal policy risk? Obviously, it's a very key question at this time as we're coming, hopefully, to the end of this sort of pandemic period. Now, I'm sure many people are already very familiar with the Zoom platform, but just in case you're not, let me point out a couple of options for you. We have a chat function. We will keep that for technical details, but we do want to hear a really good discussion. We really want to hear your questions. So please use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. Simply click on that and type your questions into the box. Keep them concise, and if they're directed at one particular speaker rather than the other, also make that clear. You can do it anonymously, but we would actually really like to know who you are so we can get you the answer you need. And with that, let me introduce our speakers. If they want to switch on their videos now. Thank you very much, ladies. First off, this function, we're going to hear from both of you, setting out your positions, and then we're going to go into the discussion format. First of all, let's welcome Irem Güçeri, who is from the University of Oxford and EconPol, and will be presenting your research. We're going to hear all about that, supporting firm innovation in R&D. We're also going to hear, thank you very much for joining us, Ruzica Rakic, who is at DG Research and Innovation in the European Commission and has been an economic analyst there since 2019 with a special focus on sustainability, one of the watchwords I think we're going to be looking at in the coming months and years. So with that, let me hand over, Irem, to you. Please, we're all looking forward to hearing about this research.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for this introduction. It's a great pleasure to be talking about various pieces of research I've done so far, and also to be sharing this virtual stage with Ruzica today. I'll be looking forward to the questions from the audience. I'll share my screen and show a few slides just to introduce what we're going to be talking about. And Jennifer, could you confirm that you can see my screen? And thank you. Right, so I'll start by asking a basic question. Let's go back to basics before we get into the optimal policy or the tax incentives, and ask if there is a role for government or policy at all in research and innovation. And if we were sitting in one room together in a seminar format, I would ask the audience whether you've seen the SpaceX launch last month. It was this fantastic event. And we say, okay, wow, the private sector can really do this, can really handle this kind of big investment, send that slick Falcon 9 to space and, move this whole space exploration to the hands of the private sector. In the background, of course, what we don't really know or watch, I mean, even though NASA and SpaceX officials are sitting next to each other during the launch, is how much government subsidy has flown into this spectacular event. And actually, billions of dollars of government subsidies supported SpaceX or support Elon Musk's various ventures, which kind of goes to show that there is a role, there's a massive role for the private sector, but there's also a massive role for policy in supporting innovation and R&D. But we should also think about the innovation as an ecosystem rather than just think about the businesses and perhaps just the businesses and the government. We have universities and research institutes which carry out basic research, fundamental kind of query into science, which perhaps the private sector doesn't have the incentives to do so. Again, we have banks, business angels, venture capitalists, private equity that put money into these kinds of activities. So they're an essential part of the ecosystem as well. And us consumers or the government and businesses who demand services, the products of innovation, are also a very, very important component. And at the bottom, two bubbles, here you see the government in its policymaker role and the business sector in its performer of R&D role that we're going to kind of focus more on in today's discussion. Are tax incentives essential for a strong innovation performance? And this is a very, very sort of selected sample of countries. But we see like the thing that strikes out here is this brown dashed line with triangles that starts at the bottom in 2000 and kind of is in a very increasing trend, that is China. And what does this graph show? It is business enterprise research and development spending as a share of total output produced by businesses. So what this means is how R&D intensive is each of these countries' private sector. And we see China, which has a big mix of innovation policies. It has science parks, university industry collaboration, and emphasis on businesses as well as universities and research institutions. At the same time, it has a very generous tax system to support innovation. So it's a policy mix that brings that upward trend together. Well, we can talk about other things like emphasis on the patent system or the lack thereof, etc. And if the questions come up from the audience, we'll get back to that. But I'm going to compare two other countries in this graph, and that one is United Kingdom, which is where I'm based and have worked quite a bit on, and that's the red straight line with circles, and we see a relatively flat performance. And I'm going to compare that with Germany, which is the orange line with stars. Well, it's kind of like a double line, which kind of has a pretty modest but upward trend in innovation or R&D performance. The UK introduced its first R&D tax incentive scheme in the year 2000, and it still has generous R&D tax incentives in place. And Germany, for the period that we can observe in this data set, had no R&D tax incentives. So it's very difficult to look at aggregate data and take away a message that says R&D tax incentives are great, let's all implement it, or the other way around. Why do we like, or why does the government like tax incentives? Why did we have a peak in tax credits? Why did we have a peak in policies that use the tax system to support R&D? Because firms know better about what is more commercially viable. So leaving that decision, leaving which project to choose to invest in to the firms themselves is a commercially viable, reasonable thing for governments to say. Also, tax breaks might be easier to implement than direct subsidies to firms, which requires gathering a scientific committee and then administering it and then following up, etc., which usually is not so much the case with tax incentives. Having said that, firms may favor investments with higher private returns, which means if we look at, say, Volkswagen, they might choose to invest, put their R&D efforts into a cheat device rather than in clean technology. This is back, I'm taking us back a bit in time, but that's the truth. If you say, do whatever R&D you'd like, maybe they'd work on software rather than the actual clean technology. But if you pick the projects themselves, then you might get to a more socially desirable outcome. Tax authorities are not necessarily very knowledgeable in science and technology, so that constitutes another difficulty. They might need to increase capacity. And they're very, very costly in terms of foregone tax revenue. And if you design the policy badly, it actually distorts the economy much more. So the final important point is, well, we don't know if companies take on projects which they otherwise would not. So is there an additionality? Is there an effective R&D tax incentives that make firms invest more relative to the counterfactual scenario? Now, in the interest of time, I will just say that there is evidence that tax incentives increase R&D spending on average for firms, but that comes with a caveat. And the caveat is that there's a lot of variation across different firms that perform R&D. And if we think about other incentives, other tax incentives as well, like, purchase machinery and do the firms become more productive, that's a more broad-based policy. But R&D intensive firms, innovative firms, that are by nature very different from each other. And therefore that heterogeneity results in a heterogeneity in responses from the firms as well. So young firms respond differently than older firms, or high R&D firms or high-tech sectors respond differently from low-tech sectors, but that doesn't mean that you don't need research and development in a low-tech sector. There are cross-country differences in both policy implementation and effectiveness and the nature of R&D and innovation. We don't have very solid evidence that the R&D that's generated by tax incentives then translate to higher productivity. And maybe one more that I will point out here is that do firms merely move R&D from France to the UK or from the UK to, I don't know, Belgium as they increase their R&D tax incentives, or if we get a global increase in R&D efforts, which then make everybody better off. So these are open questions still that are unanswered by the existing literature. I'll just wrap up with some conclusions, some findings from my own work, and I'll give two examples from two papers that used UK data. What I did with various co-authors is we looked at comparable types of firms which had access to more and less generous R&D tax incentives. And the firms that had more generous R&D tax incentives, as they got these benefits, the generous benefits, increased their spending more relative to the firms that did not get that generous treatment. And actually that R&D spending was largely driven by an increase in R&D personnel. So they hired more people, which means they actually scaled up their R&D projects, which is in line with the intentions of the government when they introduced this policy. We also kind of calculated the cost to the government, and it looks like that particular policy, for every pound foregone in corporation tax revenue, firms spent an additional pound in R&D. So, but we also found that there were heterogeneities across different types of firms. So we find these positive effects of R&D tax credits, but we looked at a particular type of firm, which was medium-sized firms. So the overall welfare benefit from a policy of this type should depend on the overall impact, but which is very, very difficult to measure. Do large firms also increase their spending on R&D when they are faced with a more generous tax treatment? And also, are spillovers to the overall society large enough to justify the cost of a policy like this? In other words, is there more sort of investment in, say, clean technology rather than a cheap device? And that's only a specific example, but this is just, I think, a good representation of what we want to expect from, what we expect or what we want from a policy like this, as opposed to what might happen in a laissez-faire kind of market outcome. So thank you very much. I'll look forward to the debate.
Thank you very much. I think we can remove your screen sharing now. And I can put you on mute. Great. Thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating. And I know, of course, you're talking about specific country cases, as we saw in some of those charts. But I'm going to turn now, Ruzica, you're in the European Commission. You're going to give us the European perspective, which is slightly different and comes with various differences and elements that we in Brussels, anyway, like to talk about. So over to you.
Thank you very much. So, all right. So first of all, many thanks for having me in this discussion. This is definitely very important and very timely discussion, as the tax incentives are definitely gaining popularity in the EU countries and elsewhere in this policy mix of the public support of the business R&D. So yeah, thank you very much, and also many thanks to Irem for this very informative introduction. So I will actually start with the very similar graph as Irem, but just positioning the EU in the world landscape. So, it's obvious that business R&D intensity in the EU is significantly lower when compared to other main economies. And there is a big case for the public support of the business R&D intensity. Well, due to as Irem already introduced, but I'll just repeat a few reasons. It's mostly due to the very nature of the research and development. So including the public good characteristics, the externality the technological and market uncertainty, and of course, one of the most important, especially in these times of crisis, it's the financial constraints. So the government, the EU government, are increasingly supporting the business R&D in the EU. And in addition to the grants, to the direct support, such as grants, purchases of R&D services, and so on, EU governments are increasingly using the R&D tax incentives, especially since the outset of the financial and economic crisis, to stimulate business R&D investment and to boost productivity and economic growth. So if we want now just to have a brief, just to briefly see what is the situation in the EU at the moment, looking at the tax incentives for R&D, we see that over the last decade, the expenditure-based tax incentives have become a major instrument for the business innovation support policy tool, and in the sense how many countries are using it, and as a percentage of the total public support. So in the EU, the number of countries offering R&D tax incentives, it increased from 12 in 2000 to 21 in 2018 until we have the data. However, as also Irem just mentioned, Germany also introduced it this year, 2020. So yes, it's now 22 countries. And what we can see is that in 2017, the tax incentives for R&D in the EU accounted for actually 55% of the total public support for business R&D. And it increased 3 times since in the last decade. Just a second. So if we now want to move to see what is actually the current policy mix of the public support of the business R&D, we see the following graph. So, it's, as I said, so the total public support is now dominated by tax incentives by 55%. And also the total public support increased in the EU over the last decade. Now it's, of course, a very important question to learn actually what instruments are more suitable, so what instruments are better to increase the business R&D intensity. And this brings us to the question of course, what is the optimal policy mix? So I'll just actually start with a few questions to just open this discussion. So first of all, also what Irem said, and what is the main question, it is that we need further access to we need to further learn what is the R&D input additionality of tax incentives and the report and direct support mechanism. Meaning that what is the amount of R&D induced by one monetary unit of public funding? Yeah. So for this, so there is now a growing evidence, also what Irem already mentioned, that it really depends on the type of the firm, so on the size of the firm, of the age of the firm, so whether it's a startup or not. And also it really depends on the industry, so on the sector where the firm is performing. So this is the first consideration that we have to take in account. Then also, it's also important to see what is the impact of tax incentives on the innovation and follow up as a competitiveness and growth. So what is the output additionality? And finally, we also need to know, like in the line of the European Green Deal. So what is the optimal policy mix to actually address the societal challenges? Yeah? So what R&D do we want to support? And in line with that, like what policy instrument is then optimal, whether tax incentives or direct support? So yeah, I think I'll just stop here and open the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think I can remove that and we can stop sharing your screen. So Irem, I'm sure you were listening closely. I could see you concentrating there. Ruzica asked quite a few questions, but let me ask you, I mean, is a policy mix, if we think that it must be a mix, is that a static thing or does it flow? And if it flows, how do we measure it?
Oh, that's a very good question, actually. It definitely is not static, and one size does not fit all. So the problem is, of course, we say, oh, Silicon Valley is fantastic, so let's create a Silicon Valley in various different countries. And it's a very unique environment there. So there's no other Silicon Valley, and probably there's not going to be, but there's going to be other types of valleys or not. Like, and there are other types of hubs now. There are different best practices, but for example, I think Israel's example is given quite frequently, the spillovers from defense military-based R&D, but that's also a very unique kind of geopolitical kind of environment in which Israel has to operate and then has to produce the R&D from. Or if we think about China again, the kind of workforce or the political environment that leads to this is very, very unique. But if we look at the graph that I've shown where, or actually Ruzica has also shown, that goes from, you know, like a much lower R&D intensity in business to a very high point for China, for example. I mean, it can be talked about as a best practice, but in different societies where perhaps intellectual property protection is much more emphasized, again, you know, a lot of different forces have to come together to produce this. But in a way, we see that trend tells us that circumstances change quite rapidly. And if you focus on, say, low-tech sectors in the beginning, you might want to then, once you've built up some R&D capacity, you might want to then switch to a more sort of high value-added sector as well. So these are all very organic. And I think, you know, it's not saying let's implement one policy and see what happens. Let's put all our eggs in one basket. And whenever I talk to practitioners, I mean, it was not very long ago that a gentleman from Germany, a scientist from Germany, had built up this lab and business in the UK. And he said, well, everything kind of is pretty generous here. So the point was that there's the patent box, there's the R&D tax credits, there is the you know, innovation vouchers and all of these other things. And there's lots of VC venture capital investment here and venture capital incentives as well. So it kind of makes sense for me to set up shop here. That's not to say it's just the policy environment that gets me here, because you have, you know, good universities, good people to work with, the workforce, the sort of knowledge base as well kind of matters too. So these all have to get together, and then it also has to adapt to the changing environment. So it's definitely a dynamic process.
Yeah, Ruzica, I'd like your thoughts on that as well. How do you measure success in defining this new policy mix if it's so much in flux, as Irem is saying?
Exactly. Well, exactly. So policy mix. So I'll first say just a very few words on what is the policy mix? Yeah. So in this specific case, yeah. So it is like either we go for more direct or more for the indirect support, and we see that those two ways that's not either or, so it's like more complementary because both tools have their advantages and disadvantages. So so tax incentives are definitely have like less burdensome for the companies. They have like definitely lower administrative cost for planning and so on. However, they're also very general, and they're also very general. But if we want to target something, so to encourage higher risk projects, to better meet some specific policy goals, or as I already mentioned, societal challenges, then probably the grants, like direct support, is a better tool. So, however, it really brings with it like a very high administrative cost, and we need like a lot of people involved. So what I mean is that, so there are like those two tools that are very different and that are suited for, I would say, a little bit different purposes. And then you say, how do we measure it? That's also our key question. So the measurement and actually the monitoring of what's going on. And I would just like first to mention that through the Horizon 2020 co-founded OECD project, Tax for Inno, so we actually have, since 2007, like very good databases of the tax incentive instrument, of the R&D tax incentives. So what we get from there, it's like a really yearly collection of the data on the R&D tax expenditure and the design of tax incentive schemes. Also through this program, like they develop a time series of the standard indicators of the use of the tax incentives. But what is more, and this is coming very soon, it is really looking at the microdata, so at the company level data, and analyzing what is the input additionality of different instruments. And so we really then, some already existing results show that also, as Irem said, that we see that there is like a higher input additionality in the small and young companies. Also, so what I want to say is that through this project, we will now get actually like really excellent data set like that start looking at this problem of the input additionality, and they will really give us, they're really trying to quantify that. So yeah, stay tuned.
Yeah, I want to follow up on a question on that's from one of our attendees. You were talking about the split between direct and indirect support and how it differs depending, but does it differ between specific sectors or specific technologies?
Yeah, so I just want to support Ruzica's last point before I answer that, because I mean, I think these efforts every country has a different policy mix, and even the R&D tax incentives are very, very different in their nature. So to put them together and make them comparable to each other and actually put out indicators for evidence-based, more informed policymaking is so important for both academic research and also for policy. It's just, I think, it shouldn't be like, oh, and that's the data issue. It's actually, I think, at the core of this future of policymaking, more informed policymaking as well. Just getting to the question. So it's about heterogeneities across sectors and issues related to direction of innovation rather than its rate. So maybe we can clarify the second bit of the question. But sectoral differences are quite difficult to quantify on paper. You have all these R&D labs, and it's, I think in general, in collecting statistics, sector of activity in today's world is not a very, very informed indicator, because you have very big conglomerates that have all different activities combined in them. And when you look at data, even if you look at administrative microdata, you see, retail. And then actually there's a huge amount of research and development done in that sector. And usually, if I look at my R&D data from any other source than the R&D surveys themselves, what I get is scientific and experimental innovation. So that's the sector that does most R&D. And no surprise, but that includes biotech, that includes software, that includes a whole bunch of things. That includes, my colleagues, when I did a PhD in economics, were now writing code to forecast oil prices because they write their own software to do that. So, sectoral differences are very difficult to pinpoint, primarily because of the difficulty in identifying the sector of R&D. If you look at data, and that's following OECD's Frascati manual, a lot of countries collect this type of data, and they ask the same questions. I've seen that data set in many other countries at the micro level. It's very standardized, which I really like. It's hard to say that about lots of other data sources. But if you look at that, then the sectoral activities I think it's more across the board. I don't think, if your research and development is in, say, pharma, you don't benefit more than any other sector. Of course, some sectors are more prone to benefiting from direct support. And I would say maybe pharma and biotech are in this particular area, because the projects are such long-term and so specific that if the government supports directly a certain project, that might create more of an incentive to take that on. But if I look across the board and if I look at the whole data set, it's very hard to see very obvious sectoral patterns other than scientific and experimental exploration.
Okay. Ruzica, from the EU perspective, what are the sectoral differences there?
Yeah, well, just to add something to what Irem has already said, it's so if we look at the R&D tax incentives, so there is some evidence exactly again from this project from the ICT, so that says that so that the most R&D intense sectors, such as pharmaceuticals, computer manufacturing, and scientific R&D, as Irem has already mentioned. So we see that actually they benefit. So they benefit less from the R&D tax incentives, not benefit, but they actually so that how much. So we have to look for this input additionality in the sense that specifies the amount of R&D induced by one monetary unit of public funding. And then there we see that the companies like SMEs, startups, and so on, that they actually benefit more, or they actually, because otherwise they might not actually perform the R&D. However, the sectors, as I said, pharmaceuticals, computer manufacturing, and so on, they anyways do the R&D. So the input additionality is actually smaller for the companies that actually already do it, and bigger for the companies that would otherwise possibly not do it. That's topic.
Okay, and thanks, Janelle, for those questions and the link that I've put into the chat for anyone who wants to go and do a sort of explore a little bit further. We have a question here from Europe Root. Irem mentioned that tax incentives are less directional than direct subsidies, as companies may go for profit-oriented innovation rather than breakthrough innovation. We know the example you're thinking of, but doesn't that depend on the incentives? Surely you can limit incentives to particular types of innovation, for example, green innovation or innovation in a certain direction.
Right, that takes me to a slightly contentious topic, I think, because we know, okay, maybe the EU has more thoughts on this, and we can debate that, but we know that the old style industrial policy did not work, like to say, well, the state will choose sector A, B, and C to support, and we will go there. And if we want to leave the decision, if the motivation for us to implement a tax incentive, support R&D through a tax break, is to say, well, we want to kind of have the firms the choice of choosing the more commercially viable options, then I think you move away already from saying, targeting or specific targeting of certain sectors. Now, there's a big climate problem that we're facing, and different politicians have different views about it, which is probably damaging for the international collaboration in that regard. So a green agenda might not be the best one to say, oh, no, we shouldn't do that there. But like if you said, oh, we want, so I don't know, we want the national car developed in a country where there's no car manufacturing as such. And should that country say, I'm going to give tax breaks to manufacturers of cars, how productive is that? From a national perspective, one can discuss the national boundaries, and within that, is that a good idea or not? From a global perspective, that's not going to benefit the world. We already have cars pretty efficiently produced elsewhere in the world. And maybe I'm diverging a little bit from the question, because perhaps if, of course, the issue of environment and policies surrounding the environment, just like policies surrounding R&D, may come as a package. And you can say, I'm going to, support R&D in green technology. And that's a decision that can go through tax incentives, that's right. But I think the more granular you get in that, oh, I'm going to focus the tax incentives on sector X, any sector X, I don't think will flow as well as green technologies. I don't know if that answers the question, but please do follow up if I didn't. I think it kind of like, of course, it makes sense if it's part of a bigger set of policies, but if it's saying that, no, we want that national car, is there a point in doing that? Is there a point in doing it through a tax incentive? And I don't think that's the case.
Ruzica, your reaction to that? I mean, how do we drive particular types of innovation?
Exactly. Well, exactly. That I already mentioned in the beginning of the kind of direct support being possibly better suited for that, because it can be directed more easily to support specific sector, as you mentioned, or the question mentioned, the green R&D or green technology. And yeah, so I do think that, as I said, so the direct support is better suited. However, we do see now that also the tax incentives in some countries, so most of the countries offer just very general tax incentive for R&D. However, Belgium and Spain, for example, belong to a very few exceptions where we see that the Belgian tax incentive granted for individuals and for firms to encourage green R&D, and we see that it can be beneficial. So, and also there is in Spain, the environmentally investment tax credit accord and for the SMEs and for micro firms and so on. So we see that now there are some movements in this direction to kind of direct tax incentives as well towards the support of the green R&D. But those are just very few steps, and we definitely need to learn more about that and to see how efficient it can be. So that I don't know yet.
Okay, we had a question come in by email. It's a bit broad. It's when will the EU create an Elon Musk or a Bill Gates? I don't know if you want to actually put a date on that, ladies, but it's I guess it's an open-ended question in comparing the EU to the rest of the world. The other question was, are tax incentives just a transition path, and do we really have a clear objective in where we want to go with them? That's again quite broad. Irem, do you want to tackle that?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the means to an end, and the end is, I think usually if you follow sort of budget speeches or budget documents or budget discussions of the countries that we're talking about here, there is a clear kind of motivation to increase productivity, overall productivity, and more variety in the market, or some solutions to some much needed societal developments, such as, I don't know, like anything from an electric wheelchair that your disabled citizens can use, to going to space. All of these can be kind of considered to be sort of within the umbrella of this broad target of achieving higher productivity and, higher consumer and producer surplus and more welfare in the society. Now, that being the objective, the big objective, tax incentives are one means to achieving that end. And it doesn't work everywhere. You can say, in some countries, if you don't have roads, you give so much R&D tax incentives to any firm that you'd like. If you can't get to, or if there are no labs, you first have to probably build the road then you build the lab, then you build the, then you get to the R&D tax incentive. That's why it's not a one-size-fits-all instrument, like any other instrument. And perhaps for some countries, it makes more sense to adopt existing technology before thinking about being, investing in biotech R&D. So there are paths, and I think it's important for the policymakers to be conscious of where you are in this different development paths. But of course, it doesn't mean one country cannot, have a massive kickstart in very interesting technologies. There are different examples around the world where, but it kind of requires capacity building You need the infrastructure, you need the roads, you need the buildings, you need schools, you need the education at the basic level before you can build up the knowledge base and the knowledge capital. So all of this can come from a very broad plan of where we want to get to. So importantly, decide on where you want to get to. And I think everyone wants to get to a higher productivity, higher welfare environment. So you can go then diagnose where in that, where in that road you are, and then move there. And I think, it doesn't have to be necessarily producing Elon Musk's. It can come from having a broad base or a specialization in certain fields of innovation, and focusing on local spillovers around, say, software or around pharmaceuticals. I guess hopefully that's answered that question.
And there are pluses and minuses to Elon Musk as well. I have now, Ruzica, from one of your colleagues in DG Just at the Commission, a question. Jan Panik asks, what are the best practices in tax incentives for R&D support that the Commission should try to promote EU-wide, and how can such a promotion be done effectively, given taxation is a member state domain? So member state competencies, we love to talk about them. But what should the Commission be doing?
Okay, so I'll then just merge that question with the previous one about whether tax incentives, whether it's more of a temporary tool and so on. So this is an initiative from so I'm from the DG Research and Innovation, but also there is this initiative from the DG Tax Wood that actually have on the European level to have like a common consolidated corporate tax base. What does that actually mean? So they actually first introduced it in 2011, and then they relaunched it in 2016. So it is a EU broad initiative, and for EU-wide R&D tax incentive system, that would actually introduce so-called super deduction. What does it mean? So that in this super deduction, it would be like more generous for the startup companies and less for the big corporations. And then this common consolidated corporate tax base, it would not replace the national tax incentive schemes, but it would be just mandatory for the large corporations and multinational corporations in the EU in order to cover those with the greatest capacity to tax plan, So, and it would be then optional for the rest of the companies, for the SME startups and so on. So there is this ongoing debate about this, and I think it is a great initiative, and that it would it cannot eliminate the tax competition within the EU, but so they can, but we can just kind of strive to make the competition fair, more fair, and also the whole system more transparent.
Okay, Panos Gridis asks an interesting question, whether there's a connection between the fiscal incentives for R&D and the tax avoidance of big multinationals. Irem.
Yeah, I mean, connection being good tax planners good being if you have the capacity to tax plan. So if you're a big multinational, you're probably more likely. And also if you're R&D intensive, you are probably making large profits. So there is more of an incentive and a resource to shift profits around. So without naming companies, we can have, intellectual property parked in Bermuda, where all the money that comes in terms of, like all the royalties, etc., all the revenue that's attached to that intellectual property get taxed at 0%, and then get also tax benefits on the input side, where you perform your R&D wherever you are in Europe or in the US or in various Asia, anywhere you are in the world. You can benefit from the R&D tax credits or super deductions on your R&D inputs. And of course, that's how large corporations end up having like very, very little tax liability globally. Now, so that's the connection. So there is a connection there that big multinationals with big tax departments will know how to minimize their tax. There's nothing illegal about it. I mean, in a way, they do it within, I mean, it's the system's problem. It's a broken system because it allows firms to do this. And that's because the system goes back to the 1920s. Of course, there is that connection. And does that matter for effectiveness of something like an R&D tax incentive? That's harder to quantify from our end because it's very hard to get micro level data on very granular micro level data on where the firm does R&D, where their intellectual property is, how much revenue is generated in each of these different locations and all of that. But there are discussions at the OECD level, you probably are aware of it, but of completely reforming the international tax system. And unless we reform that international tax system, I think these types of international incentives will continue to be there. And perhaps that's a minimizing effect on input-based measures like the R&D tax incentive, because if you're paying not that much tax, a tax incentive is going to be less likely to be effective to increase your overall R&D. So I think fixing the system is going to be better for the effectiveness of more targeted policies, such as the R&D tax incentive as well.
Ruzica, I don't know if you want to weigh into the thorny issue of a digital tax. It's pretty contentious at the moment.
It is, yeah. So it is definitely a hot topic. And I mean, I'm not working on that at the moment, but of course, I mean, I'm aware of the discussions led by the OECD. And yeah, so yeah, there is a progress there on the developing a global solution. And I'm aware that so the OECD proposed like 2 pillars. So the first one would grant kind of new taxation rights and review the current profit allocation and business location taxation rules, yeah. While the second aims to mitigate the risks that are stemming from the practices of profit shifting, what Irem was already just saying, to jurisdictions where they can be subjected to no or very low taxation. So I'm aware of this whole discussion. And the EU is definitely committed to supporting this OECD's work. But I mean, if no solution is found, as far as I'm aware, so that it will then again, that you will then make a proposal to its own digital tax. But it is just a very difficult question.
Yeah, and many big minds are working on it, so we won't hold our breath for any headlines soon. I know we're running short of time, and we have a question from Florence regarding the competition of tax incentive designs across EU countries. She says, what about the example of Wilson and the crowding out effect across US states? Irem, do you want to talk a little bit, not necessarily about the questions, but broadly, what about crowding out?
Yeah, I think it's more about location choices. So it's so France introduces an R&D tax incentive scheme. Does it mean that German R&D is going to move to France rather than we see a global increase in total R&D? And this doesn't mean more varieties, more efficiency or anything. It just means a relocation. From the national perspective, if the country wants to increase national R&D, you know, they will do that. And I know that, you know, we're talking about an EU kind of setting here and all of that. And if we think that we're one big happy family, then what's the point? But the truth of the fact is that national boundaries are still there and policymakers are interested in doing that. So there's that aspect. So even if the Wilson argument or the movement between US states also applies to European countries, maybe that's what the policymaker wants. It depends on what they want to do. The second point is that, so there is actually a current, I don't know if it's publicly available yet, but definitely I've seen presentations of co-authors with Nadine Riedel from Münster. So they have work doing an analogous exercise that Wilson did for the US on actually an international context. And they do find similar effects internationally. Now, anecdotally, it's harder to move a huge R&D lab from one country to another I think perhaps it might be easier to move within national boundaries, but actually this new working paper shows that that this also happens in the EU. What the paper doesn't tell us is that what do these firms do with the money? Like, because there is additional money coming from these incentives. So if it's going to a productive activity, or if global R&D is at the end of the day increasing nevertheless, then maybe the world benefits. So first is the national argument, moving on to the global argument. I would like to see where the money goes to. I'm not saying everyone should implement R&D tax incentives, and I don't care if it causes reallocation. I think it's an important point, and it's a distortion. So as any distortion, it's problematic. But at the end of the day, if these firms put this money into productive efforts, then maybe it could still provide some benefits or overall increased welfare. But if these firms are just like, I don't know, probably what's the worst that can happen? Give it to shareholders, they park it in a tax haven, buy another yacht. Well, that's not very productive for anybody. So that would be a problem, but we don't know. So yeah, that's the academic view.
Ruzica, what's the EU view?
Yeah, no, I completely agree to everything what Irem said, and we don't know. Yeah? So that's the biggest problem. And we see that in some countries, I don't know, for example, in Belgium, like we have a very high rate of tax incentives and so on, but like we don't know whether they're there to increase the R&D or to keep the companies here in the country and to attract them and so on. So we just so we don't know yet enough. So I'm very happy to hear about the research that Irem just mentioned. So so this is also very important for us.
Okay, I think we've time to we'll take one last question from Twitter, from Yuri Kofner. It's a little bit emerging the discussion a bit, but we see that there's a lot of stress on openness as the best way for developed economies to support innovation. But what is the best of innovation policy mix for emerging economies that are maybe lagging behind the technology border, wanting to catch up? Can you speculate, Irem, a little bit on what that might be?
I think I tried to allude to that as, during various responses, in that depends possibly on what the country needs. But again, if there are no roads and schools or hospitals, then maybe roads and schools should come first. But if we're talking about, say, a middle-income country context, there is definitely scope for putting in an innovation program that stimulates, because there are really bright minds around the world in different places. They're not just based in Silicon Valley. And in fact, they go, of course, we can get to the brain drain issues and all of that as well. But so these bright minds can produce really great innovations that will benefit humanity. So there is a role for innovation policy in developing countries. So it comes from, I think, a broad set of support. There has to be a clear objective. Where do we want to get to? And then say, I'm going to invest in my universities. And to get to universities, I'm going to invest in my schooling, education, getting young kids to think about, creative ideas and how to be, STEM related areas. So once we have, so there is education, investment in education, and then there is investment in infrastructure. So there is, of course, there's going to be more that needs to be done in the developing country context if there is the infrastructure not already there. But in many developing countries, actually, the education and universities are excellent. You just have to kind of get all the additional infrastructure together and provide the more resource into these activities, and then targeted policies to stimulate innovation. And I'm not saying targeted in the sense of saying, again, like you should create the national car. It's more like thinking about the focus on innovation. And I think, Korea, for example, provides a good example. Again, the country context is very, very specific. So no other country is going to be Korea when it started investing in its development. But it could provide a good example and lessons to be taken from investments in different areas. And again, yeah, there is a risk of, openness is in general good, and we know that there are gains from trade, but there are also sort of infant industry arguments that might lead to saying, okay, yeah, let's kind of focus on developing certain industries without throwing money down the drain, because there is a big deadweight loss. And in a developing country context, the cost is even higher because you're taking that money away from other potentially really useful activities.
Slightly, yeah.
Sorry.
I mean, slightly twisting that question to Ruzica, sort of what is the role for the EU, or what are the benefits to the EU? What do you think it should be in supporting R&D in developing countries? We know the current Commission has a big focus on the EU-Africa relationship.
Okay. Well, first of all, like I would first say about the EU. So because I'm unfortunately not enough, I was not involved in this Europe-Africa relationship. But first of all, like to the Europe itself, because also Europe member states like are very diverse when it comes to the R&D performance and in general. And so here, what is one of the main policy tools that the EU has is the European Structural and Investment Funds. And together with the smart specialization strategy, so they are very important in capacity building, especially in the newer member states. And through this European Structural and Investment Funds, like we definitely see that it improved the performance of the public science base. And yeah, so those are the main tools that actually improve the situation of the newer member states. But not only that, it's also through the yearly monitoring through the European semester.
Okay, and I'm going to wrap up now because we are actually at our finish point. But I'm going to ask you the final question. You can give me quite a quick answer. I'm asking it in pretty much every moderating I'm doing, regardless of topic, which is just quickly, do you think that this COVID-19 pandemic has given us a unique perspective, and what might be the benefits to be leveraged from a terrible situation? Irem, I'll let you go first.
Okay, I mean, it is a terrible situation, and I think we have to acknowledge that. We would rather not have had that the situation, but I think it's emphasized the importance of science and experts in finding a solution. And until they find a solution, I think we're still any economic policy is going to be secondary to solving the main problem itself. So investments and there are quite big policy related interventions in trying to get the solution. So yeah, we want more science, and policy is an important element of generating that.
Ruzica?
Yeah, well, I fully agree. Like, I think that this crisis definitely put the research and innovation, like so the science, in the spotlight, and that it really showed that we definitely need to invest more, and it's very important that public support that was the topic of this discussion has to increase, because of the businesses might now actually face even bigger financing constraints. And also what I just want to say is that this also taught us, like the crisis, that many things that we were not aware that it could be real, like such a teleworking, that so many people telework and so on. So I think that we can use these examples to actually not go back, like so to kind of go further and not 2 steps back, like when we come to some new normal. So that we should kind of somehow try to embrace this, and for that we definitely need the public support.
Okay, I think pretty obvious answers. A nice easy question to finish on there. Thank you very much, ladies, and thank you for all the attendees who sent in their questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, unfortunately. An hour is never enough time to really, we never solve all these questions, but we hope you've enjoyed the discussion. Thank you to CEPS and EconPol for organising this. And remember, you can follow them online on social media. Keep the conversation going there because there's an awful lot more to say. Thank you all once again. Have a lovely afternoon.